At 08:45 hours on the morning of October 3rd, 1952, a British corporal was walking point for a 9-man patrol through the rubber estates south of Kuala Lumpur in the state of Pahang, Malaya. The corporal kept walking. His right hand rested on the forend of his weapon, not on the stock, on the forend, ready. 21 minutes later, the ambush was broken. 3 insurgent fighters from the Malayan National Liberation Army were dead in the undergrowth. A 4th had been captured, wounded, at the edge of the killing zone. The 9-man patrol had taken no casualties. The corporal who had walked point stood in the center of the trail, his uniform soaked through with sweat and mud, his hands still on his weapon. The barrel was hot. The wood of the forend was scorched slightly where it contacted the steel. The bolt was locked forward on a live round, ready to fire again. The weapon had worked. Again. The reports coming back to battalion through the autumn of 1952 were consistent. Patrols that included a point man carrying a semi-automatic shotgun were breaking ambushes. Patrols that were walking into killing zones with bolt-action rifles were losing the first 2 seconds of contact. And in a jungle ambush in Malaya, the first 2 seconds were the entire battle. A survey of counterinsurgency operations conducted by British military analysts concluded something that should have been obvious but had taken years and lives to prove. The number of semi-automatic shotguns in a patrol was directly proportional to the number of kills made when encountering a guerrilla group. More shotguns, more kills, fewer casualties. The British military establishment had resisted the semi-automatic shotgun for years. They had called it civilian, complicated, inappropriate for field conditions. They had been wrong. The rubber estates of Pahang were the evidence. The weapon at the center of this was the Browning Automatic 5. It was the ugliest combat firearm carried by any soldier in the Malayan emergency. The back of the receiver rose in a tall square block behind the trigger that earned it the universal nickname among the troops, the humpback. It had a long, smooth barrel and a checkered walnut stock that looked as though it belonged in the gunroom of a country estate somewhere in Surrey, not in the undergrowth of equatorial Malaya. It was designed in 1898 by John Moses Browning, the same man who designed the M1911 pistol, the Browning automatic rifle, and the .30 caliber machine gun that had equipped 3 generations of American soldiers. Browning considered the Automatic 5 his greatest personal achievement. Winchester had refused to produce it. The weapon had been manufactured in Belgium by Fabrique Nationale for more than 50 years, sold primarily to sportsmen and wildfowlers. In 1952, British soldiers were using it to fight a communist insurgency in the jungles of Southeast Asia, and it was performing better than anything else they carried. It was not a civilian weapon pressed unwillingly into military service. It was the weapon that jungle warfare had been waiting for. This is the story of why the British military resisted the Browning Automatic 5 for years, despite accumulating evidence of its effectiveness. How John Browning's mechanism, the one Winchester rejected as too complex and too unconventional for serious service use, turned out to be precisely what close-terrain ambush warfare required. How the point men who carried it into the rubber estates and primary rainforest developed a set of fighting techniques that no manual had anticipated, and how the repeated success of the humpback in Malaya eventually forced the British Army to acknowledge, formally and officially, that the experts had been wrong from the start. Before that story can be told properly, it requires one admission. The corporal at the center of this narrative is a composite figure. His name, his specific actions, and the details of the context described here are drawn from the documented operational history of the Malayan emergency, and from the recorded accounts of British soldiers who carried the Browning Automatic 5 during that conflict. The ambushes were real. The weapon was real. The debates inside the officer corps were real. The kills were real. The only thing constructed here is the singular name attached to them. One figure representing the dozens of point men who walked into the rubber and the rainforest with a humpbacked Belgian shotgun and proved a principle that the military establishment had refused to accept. Their testimony is the foundation of this story. He is their representative. I spent 11 hours writing, editing, and researching this story, paying attention to every detail, to honor the soldiers who walked point through the jungles of Malaya. If this story matters to you, the only thing I ask is that you do two things. First, subscribe to the channel. Second, drop a comment right now telling us what city you are watching from. Are you in London, Kuala Lumpur, Sydney, New York, Nairobi? Our community reaches every continent, and knowing where you are helps us understand who is keeping these stories alive. Just write your city, that is all. Thank you. To understand why the Browning Automatic 5 worked in the jungle when the experts said it would not, you have to understand the mechanism that made everyone nervous. Most semi-automatic shotguns of that era operated on the gas principle. When the shell fires, a small amount of propellant gas is bled from the barrel and used to drive a piston that cycles the action. The system is mechanically clean, simple to explain, and well understood. The Auto-5 did not use gas operation. John Browning designed it around a principle called long recoil, and the difference between the two systems matters enormously to what happened in the rubber estates of Pahang. In a long recoil system, the barrel is not fixed in the receiver when the gun fires. When the shell detonates, the explosive force drives the barrel and the bolt rearward together, locked as a unit, traveling the full length of the action inside the receiver. A heavy recoil spring compressed inside the forend absorbs the energy. At the end of the rearward stroke, the bolt is caught and held while the barrel is driven forward again by the spring. As the barrel moves forward, it strips the next shell from the magazine tube and positions it in front of the bolt. Then the bolt is released, flies forward, and chambers the round, and the gun is ready to fire again. The entire sequence happens in the fraction of a second between trigger pulls. This arrangement produced a physical sensation that British soldiers described with a kind of grudging respect. You could feel the mass moving. When the shell fired, the heavy steel barrel slammed rearward inside the receiver, toward the shooter's face, then slammed forward again to chamber the next round. It was a deep, churning double percussion, a mechanical storm inside the receiver that felt nothing like any other shotgun. The soldiers who disliked the Auto-5 called it the pogo stick. They said it felt like the weapon was arguing with itself between shots. The sights bounced, the barrel churned. The whole weapon felt alive in a way that military firearms were not supposed to feel. The officers who opposed the weapon focused their objections on the friction rings. These were small brass and steel components housed in the fore-end assembly, whose function was to control the speed at which the barrel traveled rearward during the recoil cycle. They were configured in one of two positions, depending on whether the ammunition being used was a light load or a heavy load. If they were configured incorrectly, the action would cycle too fast or too slow, and the gun would fail to feed reliably. If mud or debris reached them in sufficient quantity, they could jam the action entirely. If the operator applied too much lubricating oil, the friction they provided would be insufficient, and the barrel would slam back with excessive force, potentially damaging the receiver components. The technical assessment that the patrol lieutenant had cited in his objections to the corporal was not wrong in its technical content. The friction rings were a real engineering consideration. What the assessment had failed to determine was whether those risks actually materialized in field conditions when the operator properly maintained the weapon. The corporal had his own answer to that question, and it was 4 months of patrol experience. He had walked point 19 times carrying the Auto-5. He had fired the weapon in 3 contacts. The friction rings had not failed him once. The reason was not good fortune. It was 9 minutes. Every evening before he cleaned his boots and before he ate, he field-stripped the Auto-5 down to its fore-end components, laid the friction rings on a folded cloth, wiped them dry, confirmed their configuration, and reassembled the weapon. 9 minutes to eliminate the failure mode that the technical reports had used to condemn the gun. The problem the armorers identified was real. The corporal had refused to allow it to remain a problem. The British Army had not entered Malaya intending to issue semi-automatic shotguns to its infantry. The weapon arrived through a combination of colonial pragmatism and individual initiative. In the early years of the emergency, beginning in 1948, planters, police auxiliaries, and some Home Guard units in the rural areas had been carrying commercial shotguns for personal protection, and the weapons had performed well in the close encounters that characterized the early phases of the insurgency. word moved through informal channels. When the Army and the Special Air Service began deploying into deep jungle operations in the early 1950s, some patrol commanders began making their own procurement arrangements, acquiring commercial Browning Auto-5s through regimental funds or through the network of gunsmiths and sporting arms dealers that served the colonial community. The weapons were not on any official issue list. They were not in the field service regulations. They were carried because the men who carried them had seen what they did in the rubber. The Malayan National Liberation Army was not the disorganized guerrilla band that certain optimistic early British assessments had described. It had grown directly from the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army, the communist-led resistance force that had fought the Japanese occupation between 1942 and 1945 and had emerged from that conflict with trained cadre, established jungle networks, and a military culture built around patient, disciplined operation in close terrain. When the emergency began in June of 1948, the MNLA carried that experience into its armed struggle against the British colonial administration, and by the early 1950s, it had refined a tactical doctrine built almost entirely around the ambush. MNLA fighters lived in deep jungle base areas and moved primarily at night. They knew the terrain, the ridgelines, the stream crossings, the estate roads, the paths between rubber trees, with an intimacy that newly arrived British units could not match regardless of training. They had established intelligence networks in the squatter settlements along the jungle fringe that often provided advance warning of patrol movements. When they chose to fight, they chose the time, the place, and the range. The range they chose was short. The MNLA ambush doctrine specified engagement ranges of less than 20 yards wherever the terrain permitted it. At that range, the ambush operated on a principle that had nothing to do with marksmanship. It operated on mass and speed. The fighters would wait in concealment until the patrol's point man had walked into the killing zone, then initiate with simultaneous automatic weapons fire from positions on both sides of the trail. The point man, the most forward element, the soldier whose job was to find the enemy before the enemy found him, would receive the first burst from the nearest position. The theory was that he would be hit or suppressed in the first second. The patrol would break contact in confusion, and the MNLA fighters would withdraw into the jungle before the British could respond effectively. For a point man carrying an Enfield No. 4 rifle, this calculus was essentially correct. The Enfield was a weapon of extraordinary proven merit. It had been the standard British infantry rifle through both World Wars and remained in service through the Korean War and the Malayan emergency. A trained soldier could work the bolt and deliver 15 aimed shots in a single minute. At 300 yards, it was lethal with consistency. But the Enfield's capabilities, its accuracy, its 10-round magazine, its mechanical simplicity, were all relevant at ranges where the shooter had time to use them. At 10 yards, in the first second of an MNLA ambush, those capabilities were not available. The point man with an Enfield had one option: fire the single round already chambered, then reach for the bolt handle and begin the cycling motion that would chamber the second round. In the time that took, in a well-executed ambush at 10 yards, he was dead. The corporal had thought about this problem carefully during the weeks before his first patrol with the Auto-5. He had thought about it in terms of the specific geometry of contact, the distances involved, the reaction times available, the volume of fire required to suppress an ambush initiation before the ambush succeeded. He had arrived at an arithmetic that was simple and brutal. The Enfield, fired as fast as a trained soldier could work its bolt and acquire a target, could deliver approximately 2 rounds in the first 3 seconds of contact at close range. 2 rounds, each carrying a single .310 caliber bullet, 2 projectiles. The Auto-5, fired as fast as a trigger finger could move, could deliver 5 rounds in approximately 1.5 seconds without any mechanical cycling motion. 5 shells, each containing 9 pellets of double-aught buckshot, each pellet a sphere of lead measuring 8.5 millimeters in diameter. 45 projectiles in 1.5 seconds, covering a pattern 30 inches wide at 10 yards. The jungle did not care about elegance, it cared about what was alive when the noise stopped. On the morning of October 3rd, the patrol had been moving for 40 minutes, when the corporal felt the change that experienced jungle soldiers learned to trust absolutely. It was not a specific sensation he could have written into a patrol report. It was an accumulation of signals that bypassed the verbal parts of consciousness entirely and arrived in the body as a tightening of the hands, a sharpening of peripheral vision, a fine physical attention that narrowed everything to the present moment. The birds had not called for 11 minutes. The insects had dropped to a lower register. The light through the canopy had shifted, as though something ahead had moved recently between the trees and disturbed the pattern. His hand was on the trigger guard of the Auto-5 before he had consciously decided to put it there. He stopped. He raised his left fist, and the patrol froze behind him in the immediate silence that 9 men develop after enough months together in the field. He stood without moving. He was not searching for a specific shape or a specific sound. He was reading the estate the way he had learned to read it, looking for what was wrong, what was absent, what had been added. The rubber trees ran away from him in their close parallel rows. The harvesting road ahead curved left around a cluster of bamboo and secondary growth at the edge of the estate. The bamboo was too close together. One cluster near the road's edge was angled outward at a degree that was not consistent with growth pattern or wind direction. It had been displaced by pressure. Something was leaning against the far side of that bamboo. He kept moving, slowly, keeping his weight distributed, making no sudden motion. He did not raise the Auto-5 to his shoulder. He tucked the stock under his right arm, the muzzle of the long barrel angled toward the bamboo, the weapon pressed against his ribs and held close. The officers at depot taught the shouldered position as the only viable shooting stance. The corporal had spent enough hours firing the Auto-5 to know that at 8 yards, shouldering the weapon was a motion that took time he would not have, and that aiming it at a target of a man's width was a degree of precision that the situation would not require. He was 10 yards from the bamboo when a shape separated from the vegetation to the left of the road. Not a full silhouette, an arm, a shoulder. The angular outline of a Type 51 carbine sweeping up to a firing position. The corporal saw it in the same fraction of a second the insurgent saw him. The distance was 11 yards. The corporal pulled the trigger. The Browning Automatic 5 produces a report that is unlike any other shotguns. It is a deep, rolling explosion that seems to emanate from inside the receiver rather than the muzzle, because the barrel is still moving rearward through the long recoil stroke when the pellets clear the muzzle. Layered behind this blast is the sound of the mechanical cycling. The barrel slamming back against its spring, the carrier snapping up, the next shell lifting toward the chamber, the barrel driving forward, and the bolt slamming home. Together, these sounds produce a continuous percussion that British soldiers called various things, none of them polite, but that all agreed felt like a physical event rather than a weapon firing. You felt it in the teeth. You felt it in the chest. At 11 yards pointed at a man, it was an announcement of consequences. The first shell caught the insurgent in the chest. At that range, the 9 pellets of double-aught buckshot had not yet spread to any significant degree. They struck in a pattern approximately 5 inches across, each pellet carrying roughly 400 foot-pounds of energy. The man went backward into the secondary growth. The Type 51 went into the dirt. The corporal had already fired the second shell. He did not aim the second shot. He swept the muzzle toward the bamboo cluster and pulled the trigger. The double-aught buckshot went through bamboo the way double-aught buckshot goes through bamboo at 9 yards, comprehensively, carrying splintered cane with it, spreading the wreckage of the vegetation into whatever was behind it. Something in the bamboo made a sound. The corporal was already moving left, breaking off the center of the trail that any well-set ambush would have been designed to bracket. Third shell into the secondary growth where the motion was. Fourth shell sweeping right across the road where the covering position would logically be. He went behind a rubber tree as the remaining MNLA fighters in the ambush opened fire. He was behind the tree before the first burst from the far side of the road had finished cutting through the air where he had been standing. The noise from the Auto-5 had not allowed them time to initiate cleanly. They had been forced to fire at a moving target through disturbed vegetation while their ears were still processing what had just happened to their point man and their bamboo position. This was the moment the critics had said would end him. 5 shells and the gun was empty. The Enfield held 10. Mathematics of survival. The corporal was aware of the critique and had concluded that the critics were measuring the wrong thing. They were comparing magazine capacity on the assumption that the contact would be long enough for the full magazine to matter. They were imagining a sustained firefight at known range where controlled marksmanship was possible. They were not imagining the first 4 seconds of an MNLA ambush at 11 yards, where 5 shells in 1.5 seconds had already changed the fundamental terms of the contact. The ambush had needed to kill or suppress the point man in its first moment, to function as designed. It had failed to do either. Everything after that was the MNLA fighting from a position of reaction, not initiation. The corporal pressed a fresh shell into the loading port at the bottom of the receiver. The Auto-5 had a feature that most operators overlooked, and the manual described in a single paragraph. When the bolt was locked back on an empty chamber, feeding a shell into the loading port did not require completing a full magazine reload before the gun would fire. The moment the shell's rim cleared the carrier latch, the carrier snapped up automatically, lifting the shell and cycling it into the chamber in a single mechanical motion. The bolt flew home. The gun was loaded and live, less than 1 second. He pushed 3 more shells into the magazine tube while keeping his back against the rubber tree, listening to the patterns in the firing from the far side of the road. 2 of the MNLA fighters were attempting to withdraw into the secondary growth to the north. One was moving laterally, working around the root systems of the larger trees, trying to reach an angle on the corporal's position from the east. The corporal could hear the lateral movement, the way you hear things in the jungle when the rest of the environment has gone silent, and every sound is carrying its maximum information. He moved to the opposite side of the rubber tree, shifted his weight and waited. The flanking fighter was competent. He moved low, using the root structures as cover, taking his time, not breaking any vegetation he did not have to break. He had closed to within 8 yards of the corporal's position before a section of young fern moved in a pattern that had nothing to do with wind or the natural movement of the estate. The corporal turned, tucked the stock under his arm, and fired twice. He was not certain of the target with the first shot. He was certain of the result of the second. The 2 fighters withdrawing to the north ran into the section coming up from the rear of the patrol. One of them threw his weapon down, the other did not. The entire contact had lasted 50 seconds from the corporal's first trigger pull. The patrol documented the contact, recovered the weapons, and continued the mission. That evening in the staging area, the corporal field stripped the Auto-5 and laid the components on his folded cloth and examined them. The friction rings were exactly as he had set them. The action was coated in grime and gunpowder residue and fine red laterite dust from the rubber estate road, and underneath the grime, the mechanism was functioning as designed. He wiped it dry, set the rings, reassembled the weapon, and set it beside his bunk. The lieutenant who had read the patrol report did not bring up the armorer's assessment of the friction rings that evening or at any point afterward. Subscribe to this channel right now, because what you are about to hear is how the British military's resistance to the Auto-5 created a pattern of combat losses that would eventually force a formal policy reversal. How John Moses Browning died, without ever knowing that the weapon Winchester had rejected would end up in a British Army designation register, and how the lesson from the rubber estates of Malaya eventually crossed every jungle war that followed it. By the time the corporal completed his tour, he had walked point on 37 patrols. The Browning Automatic 5 had not failed to cycle in a single contact. The friction rings had not jammed. The long recoil mechanism that technical reports had marked as a liability in tropical conditions had functioned reliably in temperatures above 95 degrees Fahrenheit, in close to 100% humidity, through contact with mud and standing water, and on one occasion after the corporal had fallen, crossing a flooded stream and fully submerged the weapon for several seconds, he had stripped the gun immediately, wiped the components dry, confirmed the friction ring settings, and had the weapon operational in 11 minutes. He missed no contacts during the recovery period. The rhythm of the Malayan patrol cycle was unlike any previous British infantry experience. In the Second World War, even in close terrain like the Burma jungle, units operated in company or battalion strength with defined objectives and known operational timelines. In Malaya, the counterinsurgency patrol was a different kind of work entirely. A 9-man patrol might move into the rubber or the primary forest for 3 to 5 days at a time, covering ground that had not been patrolled in weeks, looking for MNLA campsites, food caches, and the trail signs that indicated active guerrilla movement. The contact, when it came, was almost always sudden, almost always at short range, and almost always decided in the first 10 seconds. The patrol lived with that knowledge every day, in every hour of movement, in every stream crossing and trail junction, and stand of bamboo too thick to see through. The point man lived with it more acutely than anyone else. He was the first person in the column. He was the first person the ambush would see. He was the reason everyone behind him had a chance. His experience was not exceptional among the soldiers who used the Auto-5 in Malaya. The Special Air Service, which operated in deep jungle beyond the reach of conventional patrols, made the semi-automatic shotgun a standard component of its patrol loadouts during the Malayan emergency. SAS after-action reports consistently noted the effectiveness of the Auto-5 in breaking contacts at ranges under 15 yards. The pattern that the battalion-level survey had captured statistically, more semi-automatic shotguns in a patrol, more kills in contact, fewer casualties, held across unit types and terrain variations. The mechanism that the technical establishment had condemned was not failing in the field. It was performing better than the weapons the technical establishment had preferred. The institutional response to this evidence was gradual, as institutional responses to evidence always are. The Auto-5 was eventually given a formal British military designation, the L-32A1. In the nomenclature of the British Army, the L prefix indicated a standard-issue weapon. The designation 32 was the weapon family number. The A1 suffix indicated the first mark of the design. The designation was brief and administrative, and contained in that brevity the full weight of the military establishment acknowledging that it had been wrong. The weapon that had been described as civilian, inappropriate, and too mechanically complex for field service was now a standard weapon in the British inventory, procured for specific tactical functions, maintained by military armourers, and issued to soldiers whose jobs required what the Auto-5 could do. The word standard was not an accident. It was the formal record of a reversal. What the Malayan emergency had established through the systematic field testing of actual combat was a principle that seems obvious in retrospect and always seems obvious in retrospect. A weapon is not inherently superior to other weapons. It is superior or inferior within specific conditions. The Enfield No. 4 was a better weapon than the Browning Automatic 5 at 300 yards in open terrain, where sight alignment was possible and controlled marksmanship rewarded by the environment. It was a worse weapon than the Browning Automatic 5 at 10 yards in dense rubber estate undergrowth, where the first second of contact determined who survived it, and the ability to deliver 5 shells without moving the hands was the capability that mattered. The officers who dismissed the Auto-5 were not wrong about its characteristics. They were wrong about which characteristics the war they were fighting required. There is another layer to this story that sits below the operational history, and it begins in the autumn of 1898 in a gun shop in Ogden, Utah. John Moses Browning had been designing firearms for Winchester for 2 decades by that point, selling them his patents outright, watching them put his designs into production, and sell them by the millions under the Winchester name. He had made Winchester extraordinary. He had also, through that process, given away the rights to every major design he had created. By the time he brought the Automatic 5 to Thomas Bennett, Winchester's president, he had decided that the arrangement was no longer acceptable. He wanted royalties, a portion of every gun sold. Bennett looked at the design, the humpbacked receiver, the long barrel, the internal mechanism of springs and friction rings, and told Browning it was the ugliest gun he had ever seen. Then he refused the royalty arrangement. Winchester would continue to buy Browning's patents outright, or they would not buy them at all. Browning left Winchester that day and did not return. He took the Automatic 5 to Remington. He was sitting in the waiting room outside the Remington president's office when the president died of a heart attack before the meeting could take place. Browning got on a ship to Belgium. Fabrique Nationale had been producing his pistol designs for several years and had made him, through that relationship, a wealthy man. He offered them the Automatic 5. They accepted it. Production began in 1902. He spent the next 24 years designing at FN's factory in Liège. He died there in November of 1926, at his workbench, of heart failure, while working on what would become the high-power pistol. He was 71 years old. The Automatic-5 had been in production for 24 years by then, and it had never been officially adopted by any major military. The military history of the weapon, the rubber estates and the jungle contacts and the L-32A1 designation happened entirely after John Browning was gone. He never knew that the gun Winchester had called too ugly and too complex for serious military use would carry a British Army designation number. He never knew that the friction rings he had designed so carefully to provide adjustable recoil management would become the center of a debate in the officers' messes of a colonial emergency that had not yet begun when he died. What he did know, and what he said repeatedly to people who asked him about his work, was that the Automatic-5 was the design he was most proud of, not the M1911, which had become the standard sidearm of the United States military, not the Browning machine gun, which had been in continuous military service since the First World War, not the Browning automatic rifle, the humpbacked Belgian shotgun that Winchester had refused to produce. That one. He called it his best work because of what it required from the engineer who designed it. A mechanism of real complexity, held together by precision and understanding, that performed reliably only when the person operating it had taken the time to understand it. A weapon that rewarded knowledge and punished ignorance, and did not apologize for either. The corporal in the rubber estates understood this. He had not chosen the Auto-5 because it was simple. He had chosen it because he had taken it apart and learned what it was, and what he had found inside it was a mechanism built by someone who had thought very carefully about what the gun was supposed to do and had engineered specifically for that purpose. The friction rings were not a flaw. They were a feature. They gave the operator control over the recoil system that fixed mechanism shotguns could not provide. The long recoil action was not a complexity in the pejorative sense. It was the solution to a specific problem. How do you cycle a semi-automatic shotgun reliably across the full range of 12-gauge ammunition loads without building a different gun for each load? The friction rings were the answer to that problem. The corporal had learned this from taking the gun apart and putting it back together. The officers who dismissed the weapon had not done that. There is a sentence in the Wikipedia entry for the Browning Automatic-5 that reads as follows. The British found that the number of semi-automatic shotguns in a patrol were directly proportional to the number of kills made when encountering a guerrilla group. The sentence cites the book Combat Shotguns by Leroy Thompson, published in the Greenhill Military Manuals series, which compiled British operational reports from the Malayan emergency into a documented record of what the weapon had done in field conditions. The sentence is 8 words of statistical summary covering years of patrol reports, contact logs, and after-action assessments. Behind those 8 words are the point men in the rubber estates and the primary rainforest who carried the humpbacked Belgian shotgun because they had worked out, through the same arithmetic the corporal had worked out, that the jungle did not care about elegance. It cared about what was alive when the noise stopped. The National Army Museum in London holds in its collection a Browning L-32A1, catalogued as a 12-bore self-loading shotgun. The record notes its procurement for the Malayan emergency and its subsequent service in Borneo, Kenya, and Northern Ireland. The Imperial War Museum holds another example, catalogued with a note that describes it as a weapon type used in the British Army during the Malayan Communist insurgency and subsequently fitted to bomb disposal wheelbarrows. The same long recoil mechanism that had cycled buckshot through rubber estate ambushes in Pahang was later used by British explosive ordnance disposal teams to fire at suspected devices from safe distances. The humpback turned out to be adaptable in ways that the officers who dismissed it had not anticipated, because the mechanism that appeared unnecessarily complex contained within its complexity capabilities that simpler weapons could not provide. Both guns sit in their institutions today. Most visitors walk past them. They see the humpbacked receivers and the long barrels and the checkered walnut stocks and make the same assessment the depot officers made in 1952. That looks like a hunting gun. That looks out of place in a military collection. They are looking at the wrong thing. The right thing to look at is the friction rings. Look at the small brass and steel components in the fore-end assembly, worn from decades of use and maintenance, set in the configuration that someone who understood the weapon had set them in the last time the gun was cleaned. Those rings are the record of the 9 minutes the corporal spent every evening in the staging area. The 9 minutes that the critics had decided were evidence of a design flaw, and the corporal had decided were the price of reliability. Those 9 minutes kept him alive through 37 patrols. Those 9 minutes are the difference between a weapon that failed in the jungle because the experts predicted it would, and a weapon that became the L-32A1 because the experts had been wrong. Drop a comment right now telling us what city you are watching from, and tell us what you think about the argument the British Army had with its own equipment in Malaya. Are you in London, Singapore, Nairobi, Birmingham, Sydney? Our community spans every continent, and we want to know where you are. Just write your city, thank you. John Moses Browning designed the Auto-5 without a customer. Winchester had said no. Remington's president had died before saying anything. He built the gun anyway, for a Belgian factory that had trusted his previous work, and he spent the remaining 24 years of his life at that factory, designing weapons that would eventually equip armies he had never served in wars he would never see, across terrain he had never walked. He died at his workbench, having never held a military designation for his greatest design. He died before the Malayan emergency, before the rubber estates of Pahang, before the 9-man patrols with point men carrying his humpbacked shotgun into the green corridors between the trees, before the friction rings became a subject of debate in officers' messes, before the L-32A1. He died before the proof. But he had known all along what the proof would show. We tell these stories because the operational history of the Malayan emergency tends to focus on strategy, the political dimension of the insurgency, the Briggs Plan, the resettlement of the squatter communities, the hearts and minds doctrine that eventually separated the MNLA from its support network. All of that history is real and important and worth studying. But inside that larger story, there are the patrol reports and the contact records and the armorer's logs. Inside those records is the quieter story of the point men who took a civilian shotgun into a jungle war and came back from contacts that their predecessors with bolt-action rifles had not always survived. Their weapon is in the museum. Their experience is the reason the designation L-32A1 exists. Their 9 minutes of evening maintenance is the reason the friction rings in that museum exhibit are still set correctly after all these years. They knew what they had, and they proved it. If this story of the humpbacked Belgian shotgun and the rubber estates that proved the experts wrong has stayed with you, subscribe to the channel so you do not miss what comes next. We go into the archives every week for another story they left out of the textbooks. Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next foxhole.